Whew, we're in the ninth inning. Maybe the eighth and ninth innings. We'll see. We just had the seventh inning stretch there. Well, yeah, who's at bat? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Woo, yeah. Well, to think again about our baseball diamond analogy, we're now dealing with a third base concern or a third base question in this session. We're now talking about one of the specific claims of the Christian faith, right? Okay, so we've rounded first base. We talked about the nature of truth. We made it to second. We talked about the existence of God and one of the many ways we can know He exists. Now we're heading for third. We're going to talk about the specific claims of the Christian faith to try to help people understand that Christianity is the true revelation of the God who exists. Okay? So, when we think about defending Christianity against attacks that might come, there could be a lot of different issues that we could have discussed in this session. Because Christianity makes a lot of different claims, right? I mean, we make the claim that there is a God who exists, but then there are even a lot of different claims we make about that God, right? We claim that He's a Trinity. We claim that He is actually still interested in our lives. He's not just a creator who got things going and then stepped back and said, hey, good luck. I'll check in later to see what you've done with this world that I created. But no, we claim that He's still intimately involved in our lives. We claim that this God who exists, that He loves us, that He has given us a book that is His message to us. So there are lots of different claims that we make as Christians, and people might have objections to any one of those claims. So there might be a variety of objections that are raised against Christianity. We'll talk about just briefly 4 categories here that some of those objections might come from. One would be the production of the Bible. A skeptic might say, well, it wasn't actually written by eyewitnesses. It was written many decades later, even hundreds of years later, people who really weren't there to see what actually happened. Or they might say it doesn't have the right books in it. There are books that were unjustly excluded from the Bible, and that makes a big difference in what we believe about God. And so maybe some objections about the production of the Bible, or some about the preservation of the Bible. These would be claims you've probably heard where people say, well, the Bible was copied and translated and copied and translated and copied and translated and copied and translated. Who knows what the originals actually said? Because, so much has probably been lost in translation, and there's all these, thousands of errors in the copies that we have in our possession. And so someone might raise objections from that category. Or maybe the contents of the Bible, some of the stories that it includes, or even the commands that are included in there. Like somebody might say, well, the Bible approves of slavery. The Bible had no problem whatsoever with the kind of slavery that we saw in the U.S. prior to the Civil War. Someone might make a claim like that. Or they might say the Bible subjugates women. It's really oppressive to women, and therefore it should be rejected. Or some people have raised objections about the miracles that are recorded in the Bible, saying, such things just don't actually happen. And so since these people wrote about miracles, we can't believe anything that they said. They were just gullible, naive rednecks, and we can't believe anything that they might have said. Or the claims of the Bible, like the claim that the universe was created, or that God is perfectly good, or that sinners face the danger of hell, or something like that. So quite a few objections that might be raised against our Christian faith. And as valuable as it might be for us to study each of those different objections, we just can't do that today, can we? It would take a considerable amount of time for us to talk about all those different objections. But since I raised them, I don't want to leave you without a little help in how to respond to those objections. Now, for most of those, your best initial response to a person who raises one of those objections would be to ask, why do you say that? If someone said, well, all these books were left out of the Bible that should be in there, you might just ask them, why do you say that? Or they say, oh, the Bible is copied, translated. It's just been lost through that process. I said, well, why do you say that? You see, too often when we have conversations about our faith, we are too quick to want to whip out the Bible answer man hat and to start doing all the talking ourselves. Because sometimes we might know a thing or two about some of these objections, and so our temptation might be to just launch into an explanation of an answer, But actually, very often, we would be better served to ask, well, why do you say that? You said the Bible has contradictions in it. Well, why do you say that? Most of the time, the person you're speaking with is probably going to pause and think, I don't really know why I said that. Or, I don't really know why I believe that or why I think that. Quite often, people are just parroting something that they saw on social media or something that they heard from some comedian who was making fun of Christianity. And they actually have no idea what the reality is behind the words that just came out of their mouth. So they might say, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. Who could possibly believe that? And you say, well, why do you say that? What contradictions are you thinking of? And more often than not, they're going to be like the deer in the headlights, because they're going to think, well, I never actually studied it for myself. I mean, I don't have any idea what, this comedian on an HBO special said that the Bible's full of contradictions, and I never really went looking for them. I just kind of took his word for it. Quite often, then, people themselves, they will come to see for themselves just how empty their claim really was. And once they see the emptiness of it for themselves, then they'll be much more likely to hear any sort of explanation you can give them. Because they now realize, whoa, I am not standing on solid ground. I really went out on a limb when I said the Bible is full of contradictions, and now that limb has been sawed off behind me. So I've got to look for some other kind of solid ground to stand on. So don't try to rush into Bible answer man mode. Okay? Draw that person out. Find out why they said the things that they said. Okay, so that's a very helpful tip in conversation. All right, but we are going to focus on one objection to the faith that may come up, and that is an objection about the resurrection. We're going to focus on this out of all these possible options because according to 1 Corinthians 15, this is where Christianity really stands or falls, on whether or not Jesus rose from the grave. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus has not been raised, then you and I are still in our sins, and we are to be pitied more than any other people. because we are believing things that are false. And not only that, but we're telling lies about God. If God did not raise Jesus from the dead, and yet we say he did, we are telling lies about God. And that's a dangerous position to be in. And so Paul points out there in that chapter just how central the resurrection is to our Christian faith. So that's why we're going to focus on it here in this session. Now I'm going to present to you an approach to defending the resurrection that has been called the minimal facts defense of the resurrection. The minimal facts defense. I hope you hear that and you think, oh, minimal facts, I like that. Yeah, don't give me a ton of facts, give me minimal facts. That sounds good. Let's go with this. But the heart and soul of this defense for the resurrection is to present just a handful. And we're just going to focus on 5 facts. Just a handful of facts about the resurrection. And then we're going to ask, what's the best explanation of these facts? Now, this was an approach that was pioneered and developed by a scholar named Gary Habermas, a wonderful Christian scholar, has been studying the resurrection his entire academic career. That he really made this the focus of his academic labors. In fact, he's written several books on the resurrection over the years. Just over the last year or so, he has released basically all of his research on the resurrection and skeptical books that he's read on the resurrection. And it's like 3,000 pages long. He's been studying this matter and defending the resurrection for something like 40 years now. So a very good authority on how to approach a defense of the resurrection. So first, let's talk about some well-established facts surrounding the claim that Jesus rose from the grave. And I call these well-established because these 5 facts are facts that even skeptical critics of Christianity are willing to say are true. Even people who don't believe in Christianity are willing to say these 5 facts are true of history. And it's because all of these facts are substantiated not only from the Bible, but also from other ancient writers who were writing about events that took place in Israel around the time of the life of Christ, and events happening in the time of the early church. And one of the things that historians look for in order to tell whether a claim about history is credible or not is whether or not multiple people from that time wrote about the events in question. And you may have never heard this before, but there are actually Roman and Jewish historians who were alive at the time of Christ who also wrote about events in the life of Christ and events that happened in the early church. It's not just the Bible that tells us about the life of Christ, although, of course, the Bible is the source par excellence of information about Jesus. But some other historical writers wrote about it as well. So that's why these facts can help us make such a powerful defense for the resurrection. Because even skeptical scholars will say, man, if you deny these facts, you're on the fringe. I mean, you are way out there. All right, so 5 facts here. The first, you've already seen it. Jesus died by crucifixion. This is important, of course, because you can't come back to life if you never died in the first place, right? Not only that, but it is also very significant that Jesus died by crucifixion, because crucifixion was a violent public means of execution. That means that a lot of people saw it happen, and it was a method of execution that could not have been survived. I mean, it's entirely implausible to think that someone could have survived crucifixion. And so it is important, not only that he died, but that he died by crucifixion, because that made it publicly verifiable that he died. And so various people wrote about this. Maybe at some point you've heard about a man named Josephus. He was a Jewish military leader who was alive at the time of Christ. When the Roman Empire, this would have been the late 60s AD, leading up to 70 AD, the Jewish people at that time started to become more restless than ever about the fact that the Romans ruled their land. And so there was a rebellion that came up, and eventually the Romans just marched through Israel and crushed the rebellion that had sprung up there. And Josephus was kind of an opportunist. He was a Jewish military leader, but when he saw the writing on the wall that his people were not going to win this war, he switched sides and became sympathetic to the Romans. But the interesting detail of that for us is it allowed him to survive the war, so he was able to write his memoirs so we can still read them today. And so he wrote a history of the Jewish people, and in it he wrote about events in the life of Jesus. And he wrote about the fact that Jesus was crucified. There was a Roman historian named Tacitus who also wrote about the crucifixion of Christ. Now, as well as those two, there was a Greek playwright named Lucian of Samosata. He was no friend of Christianity. In fact, in this particular play that he wrote, he was writing satire. He was basically making fun of Christians. But he also wrote about the crucifixion of Jesus. And so, because of those other sources outside the Bible, even skeptical historians are willing to say, oh yeah, absolutely, Jesus died by crucifixion. What about the second fact here? Number 2, the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus came back to life and visited them. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus came back to life and visited them. Now, in the past, some scholars would have disagreed with that assertion right there. But it's become virtually undeniable that the disciples really did believe it happened because of good apologetic work that Christians have done to unearth the fate of all of the various apostles, showing that the apostles maintained their testimony about the resurrection even in the face of persecution and death. In other words, they claimed that Jesus came back to life, and even when people wanted to kill them for that claim, they didn't go back on it. Okay, so that's a powerful proof that they really did believe. So even skeptical scholars who don't believe it happened, they're willing to say, well, yeah, the disciples believed it happened, even though I don't believe it happened. Okay, so they're willing to grant that the disciples really did believe it. And we can read about their sincerity in the writings of the early church fathers, who were kind of the second and third generation of Christians after the apostles. You know, some of them recorded the events of the martyrdom of many of the apostles, so we can read about those stories there. A third fact here, number 3. Saul of Tarsus converted to Christianity after Jesus died. Now, who was Saul of Tarsus? Go ahead and answer it for me. Paul, right, yeah, the Apostle Paul. Yep. He had that name change, right, to reflect the tremendous change in his life. But we know from the book of Acts that right after Jesus died, Saul was a notorious persecutor of Christians. he tried to do everything he could to stamp out this claim about the resurrection before it could really spread far and wide. And skeptical scholars are willing to acknowledge this fact largely because the book of Acts is one of the most archaeologically supported books in the entire Bible. The book of Acts talks about a lot of different people, a lot of different locations, and so many of those people and locations, facts about them have been discovered through archaeology. And so skeptical scholars are willing to agree that the basic history of the book of Acts has been well established. So they really don't criticize the basic facts of the book of Acts, even if they might push back against some of the miracles that are recorded in the book. They agree that it's based on true history. All right, number 4 here, the fourth fact, James, the brother of Jesus, converted to Christianity after Jesus died. Did you know before Jesus died, his own brothers did not believe that he was the Messiah? We read about that in John chapter 7. John chapter 7, if you want to jot that down. So before Jesus died, his own brothers did not believe in his claims. And yet, we discover that after he died, actually a few of his brothers, but James in particular, became a widely and highly regarded leader in the early church. So what happened between the time that Jesus died and James making a decision to become a Christian? What happened? Well, that's what we have to ask as we look at this fact. Josephus, who I mentioned before, he was one of the authors who wrote about James being a significant leader in the early church. There was also a later Christian in the 300s, a man named Eusebius, who wrote what was essentially the first extensive church history book. And he wrote an awful lot about James and his role of leadership in the early church. And so, again, we have these sources outside the Bible that tell us about the role that these men played. All right, and then fact number 5, that Jesus' tomb was empty. Jesus' tomb was empty. Gary Habermas, in all of his research, he points out that this fact is not quite as widely believed as the other 4, and yet still 75% of skeptical scholars are willing to acknowledge that this really is a fact. The other 4, the percentage is up above 95%. Okay, of skeptical scholars who are willing to acknowledge those facts. This one it's more about 75%. But still, that's 3 out of 4. And it makes perfect sense why so many would be willing to say that Jesus' tomb was actually empty, because it's hard to explain how Christianity would have ever gotten off the ground if the body was still in the tomb. I mean, the early Christians had enemies among the Jewish people, enemies among the Romans. They knew where Jesus' body had been laid. If Jesus had not actually come back to life, they could have easily gone to the tomb and recovered the body to show everybody that he was still dead. So it makes perfect sense why so many skeptical scholars even would be willing to admit that, yes, the tomb surely was empty, because we just have no other explanation for how Christianity got off the ground. So these are the 5 facts in the minimal facts defense. And what we have to do next then is ask, well, what makes for a good explanation of facts anyway? We want an explanation for these facts. We want to know what the best explanation is for these facts, but just in general, what even makes for a good explanation of facts in any setting? To answer that question, we need to talk about two principles here: explanatory scope and explanatory power. Explanatory scope and explanatory power. Explanatory scope tells us that a good explanation will account for as many of the facts as possible. If you were trying to explain a collection of facts, but the theory that you used, only explained one of the facts, when there were actually many others that needed explanation as well, that theory wouldn't be very good because it's lacking in scope. It leaves a bunch of facts unexplained. A theory that explained all of the facts would be much more powerful than a theory that just explains one or two of the facts. Okay? So that's explanatory scope. Explanatory power talks about how believable the details of your explanation are. A good explanation won't ask you to believe claims that are themselves highly questionable. In other words, the explanation ought to be even more certain than the facts themselves, than what you know about the facts you're trying to explain. You don't want to move from something that's more certain and try to explain it with claims that are less certain. A good explanation will not ask you to believe claims that are highly questionable. All right, now I know those two phrases, those two ideas are probably still kind of vague for you. So let me illustrate these with a little story here. I'm going to use Fred and Jeanette here in this story because of where their house is located. Okay, you'll see why this comes up in just a minute. All right, but let's imagine that one day Jeanette is baking one of her legendary cinnamon braids. And she has just pulled it out of the oven and set it on a cooling rack there in the kitchen. And now that she's got that wrapped up, she needs to run into town to do a couple of chores. And Fred is there relaxing in the living room, and Jeanette says, "Fred, I made this for an event at church tonight, so please don't eat any of this while I'm gone." And so Jeanette leaves, and she runs to town to take care of her errands, and she comes back, and the cinnamon braid is gone. I mean the whole thing. And you all have seen those. They're long. But the whole thing is gone. And Jeanette is flummoxed. She cannot imagine what has happened. And she looks into the living room, and she sees Fred there sitting in his chair, but she notices there are some crumbs on the floor surrounding his chair. And as she steps closer to him, she notices that his fingertips and around the corner of his mouth are all sticky. And so she says, "Fred, you have got some splaining to do." And Fred says, "Jeanette, you are not going to believe what happened. I was sitting here in the living room, and a biker gang came bursting through the front door. They had smelled your cinnamon braid from the road, and they came in the house and stole that cinnamon braid. And I alone lived to tell the story." Now, Fred's story is imaginative, isn't it? But do you think Jeanette's going to believe that? Well, absolutely not. For one thing, there are some facts that his explanation left unexplained, right? Why were there crumbs around your chair, Fred? Why were your fingers in the corners of your mouth sticky? When supposedly it was the biker gang who came and ate the cinnamon bread. So his story doesn't have very good explanatory scope, does it? Because there are some facts that are unaccounted for by his explanation. Not only that, but his far-fetched, lame excuse also lacks explanatory power, because he's asking Jeanette to believe something that's absolutely unbelievable, right? Biker gangs do not drive down their road. Not only that, but are we supposed to believe that they really did smell the cinnamon braid from clear out in the street? Well, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, if his story was true, would it explain why the cinnamon bread was gone, or cinnamon braid was gone? Well, yes, it would if it was true, but that's a big if, right? He's asking us to believe something that is unbelievable. So his explanation doesn't have good explanatory power. Do you see that? Because he's asking us to believe claims that are just so far-fetched that they're not very, his explanation isn't convincing, okay? So that's what we're getting at when we talk about explanatory scope and power. All right, let's now take these 5 facts. We are also armed with our 2 criteria for evaluation. And let's talk about some of the skeptical theories that have been offered over the years in an attempt to explain all of these facts surrounding the resurrection. Okay, let's talk first of all about something called the swoon theory. The swoon theory. This theory is not as popular among skeptics as it used to be. And there's very good reason for that, because it has been shown over and over to be very far-fetched. This theory was more popular back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when German scholars in particular were trying to remove all the supernatural elements of the Bible. You know, they wanted to retain the moral teachings of the Bible, but they said, look, all this stuff about miracles, we just can't believe this anymore. I mean, look, we are living in a scientific age. We can't believe claims of miracles. So they wanted to get rid of all that stuff. And so some of them advocated the swoon theory as an explanation for the resurrection and for these facts. And the swoon theory essentially said that Jesus did not die on the cross when he was crucified. They say, yes, he went through the experience of crucifixion, but what actually happened was that he didn't die on the cross, he just passed out from the trauma of being crucified. And then after his body was laid in the tomb, he had a chance to recover. And so he regained consciousness there in the tomb. And then after that, skeptics kind of took a couple different directions. You know, some of them say, well, Jesus realized what had happened, and he realized that people would probably think that he died. And so he came up with the idea of claiming that he rose from the dead as a way to just advance this movement that he started. And so some of them will say that, you know, Jesus himself essentially became a liar, that he started to claim something that didn't actually happen, or some of the scholars say no. After Jesus regained consciousness, you know, he left the tomb under his own power, And then the disciples, when they saw him again, they thought he rose from the dead. And they're the ones who started to make the claim. But anyway, that's the essence of the swoon theory, the claim that Jesus only passed out on the cross. He didn't actually die. Well, how does this theory stack up? Does it explain the facts? Well, at most, it would explain why the tomb was empty. It would have been empty because Jesus had never actually died, and he came back to consciousness, and then he exited the tomb under his own power. But that's the only fact that it could potentially explain. The other four are left unexplained, and they are given far-fetched explanations that are just unbelievable. First off, think about its denial that Jesus died in the first place. Again, that is so far-fetched because of the nature of crucifixion. It was an extremely violent, extremely brutal method of execution. And it was carried out by professional executioners. Those Roman soldiers would have known what they were doing, and they would have known how to carry out a crucifixion. This wasn't just some kind of spur-of-the-moment mob violence that was perpetrated against Jesus, where maybe you have people who've never executed a person in their lives, and yet they're just so enraged that they attack Jesus, and maybe they would have been mistaken about whether he was actually dead. But no, we're talking about professional soldiers who had been through this kind of thing before. It's just unbelievable. Far-fetched to claim that Jesus could have survived that. Okay? But then, what about the disciples' belief? How could Jesus have convinced them that he actually came back to life from the dead, that he was raised in a resurrected body that was to never die again? I mean, imagine this. If he had survived crucifixion, he would have been so bruised and bloodied and battered that they probably would have feared for his life if they saw him after all of that. They wouldn't have thought, man, he's raised to new life. Check out Jesus. I mean, he's got a great new body that's never going to perish again. It's hard to imagine how Jesus could have convinced them that he actually had been raised to new life. Or consider the other branch of this theory, that basically says, well, it was the disciples who came up with it all. Well, that's not very convincing. But what about the fact that Saul converted and James converted? How would Jesus have convinced those guys that he came back to life from the dead if he never actually did? I mean, Saul had a lot to lose by becoming a Christian. Remember that? He tells us himself in Philippians how he was advancing in Judaism beyond all of his contemporaries. I mean, how would Jesus have convinced him, hey, guess what, Saul? I came back to life. I died, I came back to life. Or his own brothers. His own brothers were apparently embarrassed about his claims during his life. They were prejudiced against the idea that he was actually the Son of God. How could he have changed their minds if it didn't actually happen? So this theory does not have good explanatory scope, nor does it have good explanatory power. What about a second theory here? This is the theory that the disciples made it all up. This theory says, yes, Jesus did actually die, and he stayed dead, according to this theory. But then the disciples made up the claim about resurrection, maybe because they realized that Jesus had launched a new movement that at times appeared quite popular. I mean, remember, at times, Jesus had crowds following him that numbered in the thousands, right? Think about when he fed the 5,000. And this theory says, well, the disciples saw the beginnings of that movement and thought to themselves, Jesus has died, he's off the scene. But if we can keep this movement alive, maybe that could lead to fame for us. Maybe we could become the leaders of the movement now that Jesus is gone. Maybe it could lead to power, maybe even wealth for us. If we're the leaders of a movement that swept up thousands of people in its wake. So according to this theory, the disciples they saw an opening to enrich themselves in some way, and they decided to take it. They decided to make up this story that Jesus rose from the grave. And then they were the ones who went and removed Christ's body from the tomb, either by overpowering the guards or bribing the guards not to say anything. And then they just started to spread the word that Jesus had come back to life. Well, how about this theory? Okay. It does at least acknowledge that Jesus died. That's better than the swoon theory, right? So this theory acknowledges that Jesus died. If this theory were true, it does have an explanation for why the tomb was empty, although I would say it's kind of a far-fetched explanation. Are we really supposed to believe that they could have overpowered the guards and the guards would have never reported that fact? Or are we really supposed to believe that they could have convinced the guards to take a bribe, or that they could have convinced the guards to somehow join them in their deception? Yeah, maybe it explains the empty tomb, but not in a very convincing fashion. But again, what about these other facts? Well, it denies that the disciples sincerely believed, right? It says they didn't sincerely believe. They just made it all up. But how then do we explain the fact that the disciples were willing to maintain their claim even as they started to get executed for that claim one by one? I mean, you think about that. And it is significant to realize that the disciples were not all killed at the same time. Many of them died as martyrs over a period of years. Now, if you were the third guy in line and you had seen two of your friends executed for this claim that Jesus rose from the grave, don't you think you'd be a little tempted to say, all right, game's up. Okay, you got us. You're right. We were just lying the whole time. If you were the third guy, what about the sixth guy? You'd seen your buddies executed because of this claim. Don't you think you would have given it up? Absolutely. Absolutely. So it doesn't explain that fact at all. And of course, then how would the disciples have convinced Saul and James to join them in all of this? Again, Saul had a lot to lose by turning his back on Judaism and embracing Christianity. How would they have convinced him? Could you imagine that conversation? Hey, Saul, yeah, I know you have murderous hatred toward us, but we've concocted a plan that we think is going to turn out pretty well for us. So why don't you join us? You can also start to claim that Jesus rose from the grave, and we think this is going to turn out pretty well for us. Well, obviously it didn't turn out very well for Saul. I mean, he started to face persecution because of all this. Eventually he died as a martyr as well. Don't you think he would have bailed out at some point? How would they have convinced James? Again, you can imagine that James might have harbored some ill will toward these guys because of the fact that they had followed Jesus and And meanwhile, James and the rest of the brothers had not. They probably thought, man, these guys are empowering Jesus to these delusions of grandeur, stoking his ego on something that's not true. How would they have convinced James to join forces with him? So it really doesn't explain the fact that James converted. Probably the most widely embraced theory among skeptics today is this third theory here, that the disciples had dreams, visions, or hallucinations and misinterpreted them. The disciples had dreams, visions, or hallucinations and misinterpreted them. So how does this stack up? How about its explanatory scope? Well, okay, it does acknowledge that Jesus died. Okay, better than the swoon theory again. It does acknowledge the disciples' sincere belief. This theory doesn't try to question their sincere belief. It acknowledges their sincere belief with its own explanation. But even in that sense, this explanation lacks some explanatory power. Because how likely is it that all of them would have had the same hallucination or the same dream or the same vision? And then how likely is it that they all would have misinterpreted it in exactly the same way? I mean, we can understand how they might have misinterpreted an experience, but all of them misinterpreting it in precisely the same manner? I mean, it's more likely that they all would have had their own separate misunderstandings of this thing, that they probably would have argued amongst themselves that, we had this dream and it's telling us this. And you can imagine that another guy would say, no, I don't think that's correct. Yeah, I had the dream too, but no, it's signifying this. All those people, I mean, you consider the apostles, but then think about in Scripture how it tells us of the many other eyewitnesses who also testify that they saw Jesus. Over 500 people on one occasion, we're told. All of these people had the same experience? Well, that's far-fetched in itself, but then they all misinterpreted the experience in exactly the same way? That's also kind of far-fetched. Also, notice how in this theory, to explain the empty tomb, you then have to add some other theory on top of this, right? Because according to this theory, Jesus was still dead. This theory doesn't claim that the disciples went and stole the body and then made up a story. So you have to have an additional theory that explains how the tomb wound up being empty. And so remember, if your first theory doesn't explain all the facts, and it requires you to add additional theories in to explain the rest of the facts, it's not a very convincing theory. But then with this, again, the conversion of Saul, the conversion of James, how would they have convinced those guys to become Christians? Even if Saul and James had had some kind of dreams or visions or hallucinations, remember, they weren't inclined to follow Christ in the first place. Don't you think they would have pushed back against these experiences, these dreams, these visions, unless they were actually coming from a place of truth and accuracy? And so the only theory that has excellent explanatory scope and excellent explanatory power is that Jesus truly did rise from the grave. That Jesus truly did rise from the grave. It accounts for all the facts, right? All 5 of them. Jesus did die, yes, but he came back to life. The tomb was empty. And why was that? Well, because Jesus came back to life and exited the tomb under his own power. And then angels were sent to roll back that stone so that people could enter the tomb and see that it was empty. Why did the disciples believe? Because it actually happened. Because the risen Lord visited them and offered them undeniable proof. There were all the eyewitnesses who saw. We talked earlier about how they touched the body of Christ. They saw him eat food. The disciples believed because it really happened. Why was Saul converted? Because he was confronted by the genuinely risen Lord on the road to Damascus. Why was James converted? Well, we don't have a record of the conversation that apparently took place between Jesus and his family after he came back to life. But they must have been among those eyewitnesses who saw Jesus living again after he had died. So that would explain why his brother, who didn't believe in him before he died, and remember, his brothers weren't even there at the foot of the cross, were they? Which seems to tell us why Jesus made that statement from the cross, you remember? He looked at his mother Mary, he looked at his disciple John, he said, "Here is your mother, and here is your son." Entrusting Mary to the care of the Apostle John. Why? Because the Lord's brothers weren't there, and they were not followers of his at that time. So what happened after he died and before James became a widely regarded leader in the early church? Well, they must have been among those who saw Jesus alive again. Now, this explanation has even greater explanatory power after we have already helped someone see that there truly is a God who exists. Okay? Remember, this is a third base issue. So by the time we would focus on the resurrection with somebody, we have already come to see that they agree with us on first base issues. They agree with us on the second base issue of the existence of God. Because think about it, if we try to defend the resurrection to an atheist, he doesn't even believe there is a God who could take an action like bringing Jesus back to life. So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Do you see that? If we try to convince him that the resurrection happened, while he still does not yet even believe that such a God exists. But for someone who already believes in God, they already acknowledge that there is a supernatural being. All we are asking them to believe now is that this supernatural being took this particular action in the world, performed a miracle that confirmed that Jesus actually is precisely who he claimed to be. So, with this baseball diamond layout, by the time we get to a defense of the resurrection, we have added much greater explanatory power to our defense of the resurrection because we've already dealt with some of those other issues, right? Okay, let's see what questions you might have before we are dismissed for the day.
I wanted to add one thing about Jesus' death. It's documented that he was speared in the side, and blood and water rushed out. That was the last of the fluid in his body. He could not possibly live through that.
Yeah, remember, we've just here been focusing on a minimal number of facts, right? There are many other facts, like you just mentioned, Kelly, the fact about, the blood and that the watery fluid in it being separated when they came out of Christ. So there are even more facts in the Bible that obviously lend credence to our belief that Christ rose from the grave. And so this is it just works even more to our favor if a person already has a favorable opinion of the Bible, because then we can add in all those other facts as we're trying to talk about all this.
Well, and then the theories, the weak possibilities of why, none of them have anything concrete to grab onto. They're all reaching and reaching far, but they don't actually sink into anything.
You're exactly right, Kelly. Very far-fetched, asking us to believe some very unbelievable things. I mean, I'm more inclined to believe that a biker gang drove down Fred and Jeanette's road, than that Jesus survived the experience of crucifixion, right?
And that is the whopper of whoppers.
Tim,
Yeah.
where does Judaism fall in these three explanations? Do they tend to go one direction with it?
Oh, with these explanations, I'm not sure exactly. And the question was, among Jewish people, is there one of these explanations that's more widely held than others? I'm not exactly sure on that. And I'm sure it would differ somewhat on which Jewish person you're talking to, because you all are probably familiar with this. I mean, there are people who are Jewish in their heritage and yet are actually atheists. There are a fair number of people who hold on to their Jewish heritage and are very proud of that, and yet religiously they're just atheistic. But then there are the other Jewish people who, are still, in some sense, following kind of the Old Testament law. I'm not aware that there's one dominant theory among religious Jews. Yeah.
I thought Jews didn't believe Jesus came.
They don't believe that he was the Son of God. They do believe that he was a real person in history, that he lived and died. They do believe that, yeah. They just don't believe that he was the Son of God. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for being such a good audience today. I really do appreciate the fact that you were willing to come. I was very genuine in what I said at the very beginning of things today. It is very encouraging for me to know that despite the fact that you have to hear me so often, you still had an interest in being here today. So I do appreciate that so much. At the end of your handout there, you'll see a bibliography with a lot of different books in particular in that bibliography that you might want to check out if you are interested in some of these topics. Throughout the notes, there were those QR codes that would take you to some videos. One of them, I think, was linked to a blog post. If you want to do some more reading or watch some videos on some of these subjects, okay? If you're not, if maybe picking up a book wouldn't be your thing, but maybe you'd like to watch a video or something, you have the opportunity to do that. I'll also point out at the very end of the notes there is one more QR code, and that one is linked to a survey that I would love for you to fill out sometime. You could do that pretty quickly before you leave today. It shouldn't take you more than about 10 minutes. If it takes you more than that, you're thinking too hard about it, okay? But that's a survey for my benefit that will give me some feedback on your experience of the seminar today, and a couple of factual questions that will help me see if I got through to you or not. on some of the facts that I was trying to teach, but then also some questions for you to say, hey, my favorite session was this session, or, this session raised a question that, that didn't get answered. Those are helpful things for me to know. The reason for that is because I hope that the Lord will give me opportunities to share this seminar in other places at other times. And that means I would like to improve it as time goes by, as much as I possibly can. So, in fact, some of you know, I was able to present this at a church in Illinois back in January. One of my buddies pastors a church up there, and so I presented this at his church, and they filled out that survey for me as well. And in fact, based on what they said, I think you today got an even better version of the seminar than they were able to hear. I took some of their feedback and incorporated it. So if you're able to do that at some point, that might serve not only me, but anyone else who might get to hear this seminar in the future. In fact, I already have one date on the calendar. At the end of May, I'm going to have a chance to share this at a church in the Wichita area. Again, on a Saturday, just like we did today. So we're all kind of together in one shot and going through this information. But got a date on the calendar at the end of May, so you could certainly keep that in your prayers as well. But please do give me some of that feedback, because you might be able to serve those folks as well. But let me pray real quick, and then we'll be dismissed for the day. God, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be together today. We are so thankful for all that you have done for us through Christ, that gives us a reason to gather at all, and a reason to talk about how to defend this faith that we hold so dear, because you have accomplished great things for us through all that you have done through our Savior Jesus Christ. And so thank you for the chance to think about how to be more effective in sharing our faith with other people and explaining things to them if they might disagree with the claims of our religion. Lord, we want to be useful to the people around us. We want to see you receive even more praise and glory and honor than you already do from those who at this moment don't worship you the way that we do. We want to see them come to faith, Lord. And so as we share the gospel with them, we want to be ready in case they have some questions or some objections to the things that we believe. So thank you for helping us to think through that today, and may you be glorified through all the efforts that we might make to be well prepared to serve you. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.